December 1964. Johannesburg Airport. Two armed policemen escorted a young blonde woman across the terminal towards a waiting aircraft. Her passport had been confiscated 3 hours earlier. Her concert tour, 7 dates, sold out, had been cancelled by government order. The Republic of South Africa had declared this 25-year-old British pop singer an undesirable person, and was now removing her from its soil with the brisk efficiency usually reserved for political agitators and known criminals. Her crime was simple. She had refused to sing for whites only. The heat pressed against her like a wall. She was still wearing the woolen coat she had put on at Heathrow 2 days before, and it clung to her now, damp and absurd in the African summer. Behind her, the members of the Echoes, her backing group, 4 men who had signed up for a pleasant tour of South Africa and found themselves instead at the center of an international incident, whispered to one another and avoided her gaze. Ahead, the policemen walked with that particular stride of men who believed themselves to be performing a righteous duty. Between them, the woman with the towering beehive hairdo and the black-rimmed panda eyes kept her chin up and her mouth shut. Her hands were shaking. But not because of the police. They were shaking because somewhere inside this perfectly constructed image of pop star defiance, the lacquered hair, the painted face, the squared shoulders, a terrified girl named Mary O'Brien was screaming to run. And outside that girl, wrapped around her like armor, a creature called Dusty Springfield was saying no. Here is what you need to understand straight away. This woman, this peroxide blonde being marched out of a country for the offense of treating black audience members as human beings, was not by nature brave. She was not a campaigner. She was not a radical. She was a shy, anxious, devoutly Catholic girl from West Hampstead who could barely order a meal in a restaurant without her voice catching. She suffered from insomnia. She washed her hands until the skin cracked. She stammered when nervous, which was most of the time. And yet, not John Lennon, not Mick Jagger, not any of the great men of British rock and roll. The first major British artist to defy the apartheid regime was a girl who stood 5'3" in heels and hid behind enough mascara to paint a fence. 35 years later, she would be dead. At 59, of breast cancer, in a small house by the Thames, with her cats and her records, and a silence that had been building for decades. She would hold an OBE. She would be inducted posthumously into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. The world would call her the greatest white soul voice of her generation, perhaps of any generation. Statues would be erected. Tributes would be paid. But all of that was still to come. In December 1964, standing on the tarmac at Johannesburg Airport with the sun hammering down and her hands trembling inside her coat pockets, she was simply a young woman who had done the right thing and was now being punished for it. She climbed the steps to the aircraft. She did not look back. To understand how she got there, to that airport, to that moment of accidental heroism, you have to go back 25 years, to a small house in northwest London where everything began with flying custard pies. The house at West Hampstead was not remarkable from the outside. A modest semi-detached property in a modest street, the sort of home that thousands of London families occupied in the years before and after the war. What made it remarkable was the noise and the food. Specifically, the food that was airborne. The O'Brien family had a tradition. When emotions ran too high for words, which was often, someone would pick up the nearest edible object and throw it. Custard pies were the weapon of choice. though anything soft enough not to cause permanent injury was considered fair game. The mother threw, the father threw, the children threw. Visitors who stayed for tea learned, sometimes too late, to duck. It sounds comical, and it was. But it was also the only language this family had for feelings that could not otherwise be spoken. The O'Briens were Irish Catholics in Protestant England. Outsiders by blood and faith, they had learned across generations that the safest way to handle strong emotion was either to swallow it whole or to launch it across the kitchen in pastry form. They never sat down and talked about love or fear or loneliness. They threw pies. They told jokes. They put records on the gramophone and let other people's voices say what theirs could not. The father, Gerard Anthony O'Brien, known to everyone as Ob, was a tax consultant by trade and a musician by nature. A tall, restless Irishman with a temper that could fill a room, he had wanted a life in music and settled instead for a life in accountancy. But late at night, when the house was dark and the children were supposed to be asleep, he would sit at the piano and play, softly, tentatively, as though the music were a secret he was keeping from himself. He also kept records, stacks of them: Peggy Lee, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday. The sound of Black America poured through the walls of that West Hampstead house like a river, and the O'Brien children absorbed it without knowing they were doing it, without understanding that it would shape the rest of their lives. The mother, Catherine Ann, known as Kay, was cut from different cloth, though the same Irish thread ran through it. Where Ob was moody and withdrawn, Kay was sharp, practical, possessed of a dry wit that could strip wallpaper at 20 paces. She ran the household and managed the money, which was never quite enough. She also threw the best custard pies in the family with an accuracy that suggested long practice. There were 2 children. The elder, Dion, who would later rename himself Tom Springfield and achieve his own fame as a songwriter, was born 3 years before his sister. He was clever, musical, confident. He played guitar. He wrote songs. He assumed from the earliest age that he would be the one to escape into music. Then there was Mary. Mary Isabel Catherine Bernadette O'Brien, born on the 16th of April, 1939, in West Hampstead, London. 4 names, all saints' names, all heavy with expectation. 4 names for a girl who would eventually reject every single one of them. She was not what anyone expected. In a family of talkers, she was silent. In a culture that prized feminine grace, she was a tomboy, scrappy, mud-streaked, happier kicking a football with the neighborhood boys than practicing her catechism. It was the football that gave her the nickname. She came home filthy so often that someone, her brother probably, started calling her Dusty. The name stuck. She let it. Even then, she preferred to be the dirty girl rather than the saint. But the shyness was real, and it ran deep. At school, a Catholic convent where the nuns wore habits like suits of moral armor, Mary O'Brien discovered that she could not speak in front of people without her throat closing. She stammered. She blushed. She developed a habit of impersonating characters from the Goon Show, Spike Milligan's absurdist voices, Peter Sellers' comic turns, to deflect attention from her own paralyzing self-consciousness. If she could not be herself, she would be someone else. If she could not speak, she would perform. The pattern was set before she turned 12. She also discovered, around this time, that she could sing. Not just sing. The voice that came out of 12-year-old Mary O'Brien was not a child's voice. It was dark, rich, full of a vibrato that seemed to belong to someone who had already lived and lost and lived again. One afternoon, in a record shop that had a small recording booth, the kind where you could cut a disc for a few pennies, she sang a song by Irving Berlin. The shopkeeper stopped what he was doing. A customer turned around. The voice filled the cramped booth like something that had been waiting inside the girl and was only now finding its way out. Her father heard it too. At night, when he sat at the piano, she would sometimes creep to the top of the stairs and listen. And occasionally, very softly, she would sing along. He never told her he heard. She never told him she was there. That was the O'Brien way. Love expressed through walls and closed doors, through music that neither of them would ever acknowledge they had shared. She had other peculiarities. She would take a map and deliberately lose herself in unfamiliar streets, then navigate her way home by instinct. She washed her hands compulsively. She lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through scenarios of catastrophe and shame. She knew in some wordless part of herself that she was different from the other girls. Not just the tomboy thing, not just the voice. Something deeper, something the nuns would have called sin and her parents would have called a cross to bear. She had no language for it yet. The world would not give her one for another 20 years. In that family, feelings were custard pies. You threw them, you ducked, you laughed, you wiped the cream off your face. You did not, under any circumstances, sit down and say, I think I love differently from how you want me to love. So Mary O'Brien grew up silent about the thing that mattered most. And when, years later, she finally did speak, in a newspaper interview that would damage her career and haunt her for decades, the words came out almost accidentally, as though they had been building pressure inside her for so long that they simply burst through the surface like steam through a crack. But that was still years away. For now, she was a teenager with a voice that frightened her and a secret she could not name. And her brother had an idea. Dion O'Brien had always known he would be a musician. By the late 1950s, he had reinvented himself as Tom Springfield, the surname borrowed from a place that sounded more English, more marketable, more like someone a record label might take seriously. He formed a folk pop group. He needed a female vocalist. His sister, still calling herself Mary, was the obvious choice. She was cheap. She was available. And that voice, that astonishing voice, was too good to waste on church hymns and bedroom mirrors. The Springfields came together in 1960. Tom Mary, now also calling herself Dusty, now also a Springfield, and a third member, Tim Failed, formed a trio that played the folk pop sound of the era. Clean harmonies, acoustic guitars, songs about flowers and rivers and love that was wholesome and uncomplicated. It was pleasant music. It was successful music. Their single, Silver Threads and Golden Needles, reached the top 20 in America in 1962, making the Springfields the only British group to achieve that feat before a certain quartet from Liverpool changed everything. And yet, from the very beginning, something was wrong. Not with the music, which was competent and occasionally charming. With the fit. Dusty Springfield, she was fully dusty now. The last traces of Mary, scrubbed away like mud from a football, did not want to sing folk. She wanted to sing soul. She had grown up on Peggy Lee and Ella Fitzgerald, on the blues her father played in the dark. She heard Motown coming out of American transistor radios and felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition so deep it was almost physical. That music, the churchy wail, the gospel fervor, the raw ache of voices singing about love as though it were a matter of life and death, that was hers. She knew it the way you know your own heartbeat. Tom did not agree. Tom wanted folk. Tom was the leader, the songwriter, the elder brother. He made the decisions. She sang the notes he gave her. "I want to do something different," she told him once, in a conversation that biographers have reconstructed from interviews given years later. "You sing what works," Tom said, or words to that effect. She paused. She had spent her whole life being told what to do by people who loved her. "It works for you," she said, "not for me." He did not understand. Perhaps he could not. He was a craftsman. She was something else, something that did not yet have a name, but was pressing against the inside of the folk pop box he had built for her, pressing harder with every performance, every television appearance, every polite round of applause from audiences who liked her well enough but had no idea what she was capable of. She left in late 1963, walked away from the group, from her brother's protection, from the only professional framework she had ever known. It was terrifying. It was necessary. Tom had given her a surname and a start, but the voice was hers alone, and it demanded a different kind of music. Tom would go on to write successful songs for other artists, including Georgie Girl for the Seekers. He and Dusty remained in contact throughout their lives, though the relationship was complicated by the particular tensions that exist between siblings who have once been business partners. He was there, at a distance, during her years of decline. He was not there by her own choice at the end. The bond between them was real but strained. Like so much else in Dusty's life, it was a connection that never quite found its proper shape. She built herself a new face for the new life. The beehive, that towering confection of peroxide and hairspray, was not strictly speaking hair. Her natural locks had been bleached so many times they had begun to fall out in clumps. So she wore wigs, or half-wigs, or elaborate constructions that blurred the line between natural and artificial. The image she presented to the world was quite literally built on destruction. She had ruined her own hair to create something more spectacular, more untouchable, more unlike Mary from West Hampstead. Then the eyes, black coal applied in thick rings that gave her the look of a beautiful raccoon. She said once to a journalist who asked about her makeup that without it she felt naked. The word matters. Not incomplete, not plain, naked, exposed. As though the face underneath the paint were something shameful, something that needed to be hidden. Mary's face. The face she was born with. The face she covered every morning with a mask so elaborate it took an hour to construct. And finally, the voice. What was it that made the sound she produced so different from every other white pop singer of her era? Technically, it was a matter of phrasing. She sang behind the beat, a fraction late, a breath delayed, in the style of Billie Holiday and the great black vocalists she had absorbed through her father's record collection. This technique, called back phrasing, created an effect of languorous intimacy, as though she were telling you a secret she was not entirely sure she should share. There was a crack in the voice, too. Not a flaw, but a feature, a hairline fracture through which something raw and unguarded seeped. Other singers hit notes. She inhabited them. The transformation was complete. Mary O'Brien had become Dusty Springfield. Blonde, glamorous, armored in coal and hairspray, possessed of a voice that could make strangers weep without understanding why. The shy girl who stammered and washed her hands until they bled was gone. Or rather, she was still there, inside, underneath, behind the mask, but she had been told to be silent, and for a while she obeyed. Tom Springfield had given his sister a name and a beginning. Dusty Springfield gave herself a face, a voice, and a future. whether she also gave herself a prison, a gilded, lacquered, immaculately made-up prison from which Mary O'Brien would spend 30 years trying to escape, is a question that would not be answered for a very long time. By then, the cost of the escape would be measured in broken teeth, empty bottles, and hospital admission forms signed in a hand that could no longer hold a pen steady. But in late 1963, none of that had happened yet. She was 24 years old, newly solo, radiantly blonde, and ready for the world. The world, as it turned out, was ready for her too, though it would take a detour through the ugliest political system on earth before either of them understood what that meant. Within 12 months, she would be standing on an airport tarmac in Johannesburg, being deported for the crime of human decency. And her hands, inside the pockets of that ridiculous wool coat, would be shaking, not from the confrontation outside, but from the war within. The story of what happened in South Africa has been told many times, but rarely with the detail it deserves. It was not a grand political gesture. It was not planned as an act of resistance. It was, in the way that most genuinely courageous acts are, something that happened because one person looked at an injustice and found herself unable to pretend she had not seen it. Dusty Springfield arrived in South Africa in December 1964 with a contract that specified, in clear legal language, that all her performances would be before integrated audiences, black and white together. This was the condition she had set before agreeing to the tour, and it had been accepted, or so she believed, by the promoters. Whether the South African authorities were aware of this clause from the beginning and chose to ignore it, or whether they assumed a 25-year-old pop singer would comply with the country's racial laws once she saw the reality on the ground, remains unclear. What is clear is that they misjudged her completely. She performed at a venue near Cape Town. The audience was mixed. Black faces and white faces watched the same stage, heard the same voice, occupied the same air. In most countries on earth, this would have been unremarkable. In South Africa, under the laws of apartheid, it was an act of defiance so provocative that the machinery of the state swung into action within hours. Her passport was seized. She was questioned. The remaining dates of her tour were cancelled. And then she was escorted to the airport and put on a plane. The Echoes, her backing musicians, were expelled alongside her. The Reflex had roots. Her father, Ob, had told stories, not often, not dramatically, but with the bitterness of a man who had lived through them, about what it meant to be Irish in England. The signs in boarding house windows, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, the assumptions, the sneering, the sense of being tolerated rather than accepted. Mary O'Brien had grown up in a household where the memory of discrimination was passed down like family china, handled carefully, never displayed, but always present. She knew what it felt like to be told you were lesser. She knew it in her bones. So when she stood in that concert hall near Cape Town and saw a mixed audience looking back at her, and when the authorities told her this was not permitted, something in her, something inherited, something Irish, something that predated Dusty Springfield and belonged entirely to Mary O'Brien, simply refused. She sang for everyone, and then she accepted the consequences. It was 1964. The cultural boycott of South Africa would not become a mainstream movement for another 2 decades. Artists against apartheid were still far in the future. What Dusty did, she did largely alone, and the world noted it, praised it briefly, and moved on. She moved on too, back to London, back to the recording studio, back to the extraordinary run of hit singles that was making her the biggest female pop star in Britain. I only want to be with you. Wishin' and hoppin'. I just don't know what to do with myself. Song after song about love, wanting it, losing it, not knowing how to hold it, delivered in that dark, aching, utterly distinctive voice. The critics adored her. The public adored her. She appeared on television, her own shows, variety specials, guest spots, and was charming, funny, quick-witted in a way that disguised the terror she felt before every appearance. She giggled like a teenager during interviews, disarming journalists with such warmth that none of them suspected she had spent the previous hour in the dressing room, shaking. On one memorable occasion, on the 5th of June 1968, she sang a duet of Mockingbird with Jimi Hendrix on her own ITV program, It Must Be Dusty. Consider that image. Dusty Springfield, beehive immaculate, pearls in place, standing beside the most incendiary guitarist of his generation, matching him note for note, grin for grin. The full recording was wiped, as was standard practice for ITV at the time, but a fragment survives on degraded 8mm film, and it shows two musicians from entirely different worlds finding common ground in a joyful song about a mockingbird. She held her own. She always held her own. That was what the armor was for. But behind the armor, behind the cameras, behind the closed door of whatever flat or hotel room she retreated to after the lights went down, there was Mary. And Mary was falling in love. Her name was Norma Tenga. She was American, a singer-songwriter from California of Filipino heritage, with dark eyes and a free spirit that belonged to a different era, or perhaps to no era at all. She had written and recorded a minor hit called Walkin', My Cat Named Dog in 1966, a song as eccentric and charming as its title. She was an artist in every sense. She painted, she sculpted, she moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had never been taught to be ashamed of who she was. They met on the London music scene in the middle of 1966. The attraction was immediate. For Dusty, who had spent her entire adult life suppressing and hiding the truth of her desires, meeting Norma was like stepping out of a locked room into open air. Here was a woman who did not flinch, who did not apologize, who looked at Dusty and saw not the beehive or the panda eyes or the carefully constructed pop star persona, but the frightened girl underneath, and loved her anyway. They moved in together. In London in the mid-60s, two women sharing a flat raised no eyebrows. Flatmates, people assumed. Friends, colleagues. The music industry knew the truth, it always does, but operated according to an unspoken agreement. We know, but we do not say. You pretend to be what we need you to be, and we pretend to believe you. Dusty honored the contract. In public, she was the glamorous, unattached pop star, available in the audience's imagination to any man who wanted her. In private, she came home to Norma. They cooked together. They argued. They played records and talked about music with the intensity of two people for whom music was not a career but a vital organ. And sometimes late at night, when the mascara was off and the wig was on its stand and Mary O'Brien was allowed to exist for a few hours, they were simply two people in love. It was, by all accounts, the happiest period of her life. Her career was at its peak. Her voice was at its most powerful. The hits kept coming. And she had someone to come home to, someone who knew her real name, her real face, her real heart. But happiness, for this woman, was always a borrowed thing. She held it the way you hold water in your hands, tightly, desperately, watching it leak through your fingers. The secrecy corroded everything. Every interview in which she was asked about boyfriends and had to smile and deflect. Every photograph in which she posed alone while Norma waited at home. Every casual touch that had to be checked and suppressed. The effort of it was grinding, relentless, cumulative. It wore her down the way years of weather wear down stone. You could just tell them, Norma said once, in a conversation that biographers have pieced together from later interviews. I could tell them, yes, Dusty replied. But I can't tell myself. It was not a joke. The world's disapproval she could have weathered. She had weathered South Africa. But the voice inside her own head, the voice of the nuns, the voice of the catechism, the voice that said this love is sin and you are damned, that voice she could not silence. Not once in her entire life did Dusty Springfield have a romantic relationship with a man. Not once. Every biographer who has examined the record confirms this. She was, in the plain facts of her life, a woman who loved women. And yet she could never quite bring herself to say so without qualification, using words like bisexual, open, fluid, leaving one door ajar in a house where every other door had been slammed shut by the church, the industry, and the times she lived in. The relationship with Norma lasted roughly 4 years. By the early 1970s, the erosion had done its work. The secrecy, the strain, Dusty's escalating anxiety and drinking, all of it combined to create a pressure that no love, however genuine, could withstand. Norma Tenga returned to the United States. She went home. Dusty did not have a home to go to. Not really, not anymore. So she stayed in London, alone, and began the long descent that would consume the next 15 years. Norma disappeared into silence. She gave almost no interviews about Dusty. She did not write a memoir. She did not sell her story to the tabloids. For decades, she said nothing, a steadfast refusal to turn private love into public currency that was, in its own way, the most eloquent tribute she could have offered. Norma Tenga died on the 29th of December, 2019, 2 decades after Dusty. Whatever she remembered about those 4 years in London, she took it with her. Have you ever listened to a song 100 times and never heard what it was really saying? Consider You Don't Have to Say You Love Me, released in 1966, during the first flush of the relationship with Norma. It was Dusty's biggest hit. #1 in the United Kingdom, top 5 in the United States. A song that has been played at weddings and funerals and in lonely bedrooms at 3 in the morning for nearly 60 years. The lyric is addressed nominally to a man. The melody is Italian, borrowed from a San Remo music festival entry and given English words. On the surface, a conventional love song. Don't say you love me, just be close, just don't go. But listen to the voice, not the words, the voice. Listen to the way it cracks on close at hand. Listen to the desperate, almost physical quality of the plea. This is not a woman singing about a hypothetical heartbreak. This is a woman who knows, with the certainty of lived experience, what it costs to love someone you cannot name. You don't have to say you love me. You don't have to say anything. Just be here. Just stay. Was it about Norma? She never said. But art does not work in straight lines. The singer brings herself to the song, and whatever Dusty brought to that recording in 1966, it was not detachment, it was need. Raw, undisguised, almost unbearable need. By 1968, the relationship was straining but not yet broken. and Dusty Springfield was about to do something extraordinary. She was about to fly to Memphis, Tennessee, walk into a recording studio where Aretha Franklin and Wilson Pickett, and the greatest soul musicians in the world, had laid down the music of a generation, and attempt to prove that a white girl from West Hampstead belonged there. Memphis in 1968 was a city at war with itself. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated there in April on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and the wound was still raw. It was, by any rational measure, a strange moment for a white British pop singer to arrive and attempt to record a soul album. But Dusty had never operated by rational measures. She operated by instinct, by longing, and by a conviction, held so deeply it was almost cellular, that the music she had absorbed through her father's record collection was not borrowed culture, but native tongue. The studio was American Sound Studio, a low-slung building on Thomas Street that looked from the outside like a place you might go to get your tires changed. Inside, it was a cathedral. The producer was Jerry Wexler, the man who had produced Aretha Franklin and coined the term rhythm and blues. The musicians were the Memphis Boys, white Southern session players who had developed an almost supernatural ability to play black music with utter authenticity. The backing vocalists were the Sweet Inspirations, Cissy Houston and her group, who had sung behind Aretha and would bring that same churchy power to whatever Dusty asked of them. On paper, the perfect setup. In practice, it was agonizing. The problem was fear. Not ordinary stage fright, but a paralyzing, all-consuming terror that she did not belong in this room with these musicians making this music. Aretha Franklin had stood where she was standing. Wilson Pickett had sung into the same microphone. Who was she, Mary O'Brien, convent schoolgirl, fraud, imposter, to think she deserved to be here? The sessions began. They did not go well. She could not sing in front of the musicians. She tried. She stood at the microphone, opened her mouth, and what came out was thin, strained, stripped of the quality that had made Wexler want to record with her. She would attempt a take, stop halfway through, apologize, retreat to the bathroom. The Memphis Boys waited patiently. Wexler waited less patiently. The Sweet Inspirations exchanged glances. "I can't do this," she told the room, after one particularly agonizing attempt. "Not here, not with all of you listening." It was decided that she would record her vocals separately in New York, listening through headphones to the backing tracks laid down without her. It was unusual. Most artists fed off the energy of live musicians. But it was the only way she could work. Alone, unobserved, free from the terror of being judged in real time. Even in New York, the perfectionism was savage. She recorded take after take of each song. Dozens of attempts at a single phrase, adjusting the placement of a syllable by fractions of a second. Wexler, listening to the playbacks, heard something extraordinary. Dusty, listening to the same playbacks, heard only failure. And yet, the album that emerged from this ordeal, released in early 1969 under the title Dusty in Memphis, was a masterpiece. Not a flawed masterpiece. A work of art so complete, so emotionally devastating, so perfectly crafted that it would be recognized, decades later, as one of the finest records ever made. Rolling Stone would place it on their list of the 500 greatest albums. Musicians who heard it, black and white, American and British, spoke of it with something approaching reverence. The centerpiece was Son of a Preacher Man. The song had been offered first to Aretha Franklin, who turned it down, a decision she would later say she regretted. Dusty took it and transformed it into something that transcended its origins. In her voice, the playfulness was still there, but underneath ran a current of longing so powerful it bordered on pain. She sang it as though remembering something forbidden. For a woman living a hidden life, the subtext was inescapable, even if she never acknowledged it. There is a footnote to the Memphis sessions too delicious to omit. During her time working with Atlantic Records, Dusty recommended that the label sign a British band she had encountered through session work in London. She knew their bassist, John Paul Jones. The band was called Led Zeppelin. Atlantic took her advice. The woman remembered for Son of a Preacher Man had nudged open the door for the heaviest rock band on the planet. The commercial reception of Dusty in Memphis was a catastrophe. It reached number 99 on the American Billboard chart. How many masterpieces, one wonders, have been buried by indifference, only to be discovered when it was too late for their creators to know. An album that critics called a revelation, that musicians called a landmark, that would eventually be recognized as one of the defining recordings of the 20th century, and the public shrugged. The timing was wrong. Psychedelia was giving way to hard rock, and a torch song album by a British woman singing American soul fell between every available stool. It was the recurring theme of her life, being right too early, seeing what others could not yet see. Arriving at the destination before the road had been built. Meanwhile, in the unphotographed theatre of her private life, a different kind of performance was reaching its climax. And when it ended, the applause would be replaced by something far more dangerous than silence. In 1970, Dusty gave an interview to the Evening Standard. The journalist asked the usual questions. The conversation turned, as it often did with female pop stars, to the subject of romance. And then she said something that no major pop star, male or female, British or American, had ever said in a national newspaper before. Listen carefully to what she said next, because in 1970, these words could end a career. "A lot of people say I'm bent," she told the interviewer, using the slang of the era, "and I've almost learnt to accept that. I know I'm as perfectly capable of being swayed by a girl as by a boy." Consider the year. The Sexual Offences Act, which partially decriminalised male homosexuality in England, had been passed only 3 years earlier. Gay men and women were routinely fired, expelled from their families, subjected to psychiatric treatment. And here was the biggest female pop star in Britain telling a mainstream newspaper that she was attracted to women. It was not a full coming out. The careful phrasing, as perfectly capable of being swayed by a girl as by a boy, left room for ambiguity. It positioned her as bisexual, open, fluid, rather than as definitively lesbian. Perhaps this was strategic. Perhaps it was genuine confusion. Perhaps it was the only formulation that allowed her to speak some truth without being crushed entirely by the weight of it. 3 years later, in an interview with the Lowe's Angels Free Press, she went further. "I go from men to women, I don't care, but my main ambition is to love a man. They scare me." That final sentence is the key to the entire architecture of her inner life. They scare me. Not I don't find them attractive. Not I prefer women. They scare me. The fear was not of men as individuals, but of the idea of men, of the normality they represented, the safety of a conventional life, the approval of the church and the family. She wanted to want them. She could not. And the gap between what she wanted to want and what she actually wanted was the space in which she would, over the next decade, very nearly destroy herself. The damage from the evening's Standard interview was real. Radio play diminished. Television bookings grew harder to secure. The record-buying public of 70s Britain was not ready for a pop star who admitted to loving women, even in careful, qualified language. She had broken the unspoken contract between artist and audience, the one that said, "You may be whatever you are in private, but in public, you will be what we need you to be." The industry did not forgive her. At the same time, the creative momentum that had carried her through the 60s was faltering. The albums she released in the early 70s were competent but uninspired. She was drinking more, sleeping less. The insomnia that had plagued her since childhood deepened into something darker. In the early 70s, she left England. The official reason was professional. She wanted to break into the American market. The real reason was simpler and sadder. She was running from the fallout of the interviews, from the ghost of Norma, from the wreckage of a career that was slowly losing altitude, from herself. She settled in Los Angeles, in the Hollywood Hills, and began the decade that her biographers would later call, with grim accuracy, the dark years. The first relationship after Norma was with Faye Harris, an American photojournalist. They were together, on and off, from roughly 1972 to 1978, splitting time between the United States and Canada. Harris was steady, practical, grounded. Everything Dusty was not. But steadiness could not contain the chaos that was building. The drinking grew worse. Cocaine entered the picture, the standard anesthetic of the 70s music industry, available at every party, every session, every after-show gathering. For Dusty, it served a specific purpose. It silenced the voice. Not the singing voice, which remained miraculous even as everything else fell apart, but the other one. The one inside her head. The one that whispered in the accent of a West Hampstead convent school, "You are wrong, you are broken, you are damned." Cocaine promised that the voice would stop. It lied. The self-harm became visible. Hospital admissions, cuts on her arms, episodes that biographers describe with careful circumlocution, but that amounted, in plain language, to attempts on her own life. Some biographers, including Karen Bartlett, have suggested she suffered from bipolar disorder, though no official diagnosis has ever been confirmed. What is confirmed is that the woman who had once commanded stages and studios was now, increasingly, unable to command herself. When the relationship with Harris ended in the late 70s, it dissolved without drama, without public rupture, without explanation. Harris simply slipped out of the narrative the way people do when the person they love has become someone they can no longer reach. She returned to her own life. Dusty barely noticed. By then, there were more urgent forms of oblivion to attend to. The money ran out. This is the detail that shocks people most, because it seems so improbable. Dusty Springfield, who had sold millions of records, who had been one of the highest-paid performers in Britain, whose voice was known in every household, went broke. The specifics are murky, but the result was stark. She was living on friends' sofas, borrowing money, unable to afford her own flat. The pop star who had once employed a personal hairdresser, a makeup artist, and a full touring band was now dependent on the kindness of people who remembered who she used to be. And through all of it, the drinking, the drugs, the self-harm, the poverty, there were the cats. 12 of them at the peak, all rescued from the streets of Hollywood Hills. Strays, unwanted, abandoned. She gathered them up with a hunger that suggested she was filling a space nothing else could fill. She fed them, sheltered them, took them to the vet. She donated money she could not spare to animal welfare charities. She could not save herself, but she could save them. They did not read newspapers. They did not care about the Evening Standard interview. They only knew she opened tins and was warm to sleep on. 12 cats. Not a single human being she could telephone at 3 in the morning. In April 1979, she returned briefly to the stage. 3 consecutive sold-out nights at the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, in London. The concerts were triumphant and chaotic in equal measure. On one evening, she roller-skated from one side of the stage to the other, a stunt so characteristically reckless that the audience roared with delight. She was not by any account a proficient skater. She had to be pushed. The wobble was real, but so was the joy. For a few hours on that stage, the woman the world had forgotten remembered who she was. During those same Drury Lane concerts, a person of restricted growth on roller skates appeared on stage, apparently unplanned, careening across the boards while she was mid-song. She nearly broke character. Nearly. The audience saw a flicker, a twitch of the mouth, a gleam in the eye, and then the professional mask reassembled itself, and she carried on singing as though nothing had happened. In another life, it would have been simply funny. In this life, it was a reminder that underneath the rubble, the tomboy from West Hampstead still had a sense of humor. The custard pies, incidentally, had followed her into adulthood. At parties in the 60s, before the fall, before Lowe's Angels, she had revived the family tradition, launching pastries at guests with an accuracy that spoke of deep practice. The Guardian, in its obituary, would note this detail with the bemused affection that the British reserve for eccentricity they cannot classify. Food fights at celebrity parties. Absurd. Joyful. And belonging to a version of Dusty that the dark years had buried but not killed. In 1981, she had a brief relationship with Carol Pope, the lead singer of the Canadian band Rough Trade. It lasted 6 months. Pope would later describe her as charming but completely destroyed. The verdict was so concise, so devastating, that it serves as the unofficial epitaph for the entire decade. By 1982, the burial was almost complete. She was 43 years old, with no career, no money, no relationship, and a body bearing the marks of a decade's worth of sustained self-destruction. She was attending meetings of Alcoholics Anonymous, trying again to stop drinking. And at one of those meetings, in a church hall in Lowe's Angels, she met a woman named Tedda Bracci. Bracci was an actress, not a famous one. Her credits were sparse, her name unknown outside a small circle. But she had the kind of intensity that fills a room, the kind that people who have been through terrible things sometimes develop, as though the experience has burned away everything inessential. She was at the meeting because she was trying to stop drinking. So was Dusty. They recognized something in each other immediately. Not health, not hope, damage. The mirror shock of seeing your own wounds reflected in another person's face. They moved in together within months. By April 1983, they had gone further. A ceremony of exchanged vows, held privately, witnessed by a handful of friends. It was not a wedding. Same-sex marriage would not become legal in California for another quarter of a century. But it was, for both women, as real as any wedding could be. They stood before each other and made promises. The Catholic girl who had wanted more than anything to be loved properly, permanently, in the eyes of God and the law, was finally someone's partner. And for a few months, she believed it would last. The relationship was incendiary from the start. Two recovering alcoholics, both emotionally volatile, both carrying years of unprocessed trauma, both desperate for the kind of love that would fix everything. It was not a recipe for stability. It was a recipe for an explosion. They fought, screaming matches that rattled windows and sent neighbors reaching for their telephones. The alcohol returned, and with it, a loss of control that turned arguments into something far darker. What follows is difficult to hear. But it happened, and to omit it would be to lie about who she was. During one domestic argument, according to biographers including Karen Bartlett, Tedda Bracci struck Dusty in the face with a saucepan. The blow knocked out several of her teeth. Both women were hospitalized. Dusty required reconstructive dental surgery. Plastic surgery followed. A saucepan. An object from the kitchen, from the domestic sphere, from the space that is supposed to mean safety and warmth and home. The brutality of the act was inseparable from its banality. This was not a crime of passion committed during an operatic confrontation. This was a woman hitting another woman with a cooking implement during an argument that had probably started about something trivial. The wider dimension of this incident is what it reveals about domestic violence in same-sex relationships. Dusty could not go to the police. She could not call a helpline, not because these services did not exist, but because accessing them would have required her to publicly acknowledge the nature of her relationship. The closet, which had already cost her so much, now trapped her in a new way. It made her invisible as a victim. The relationship ended sometime around 1985. Dusty Springfield was alone again, with new teeth, a new face, and the same old pain. She never married. Not Tedda, not anyone. The ceremony in California was the closest she ever came, and it had ended with a saucepan and a hospital ward. By 1985, her life read like a casualty report. Career destroyed, finances non-existent, health compromised by years of alcohol, cocaine, and self-harm, teeth replaced, reputation reduced to that of a has-been, a name younger journalists recognized vaguely, if at all, as someone their parents used to listen to. She was 46 years old. Her last significant hit had been more than a decade earlier. In the music industry, which has the memory of a goldfish and the loyalty of a cat without the cat's redeeming grace, she was a ghost. Ghosts, however, have a way of being heard by people who are listening. In a flat in London, sometime in the mid-80s, two young men were listening. Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe, collectively known as the Pet Shop Boys, were building what would become one of the most successful pop careers of the decade. They made electronic music, synthesizers, drum machines, cool detached vocals laid over melodies that were considerably warmer than they first appeared. They were smart, witty, and musically literate in a way that extended far beyond their own genre. And they were fans. Specifically, they were fans of Dusty Springfield. They had grown up with her voice. Tennant was a teenager in the north of England when "You Don't Have to Say You Love Me" was number one. They believed, with the unshakable conviction of true devotees, that the voice was not a relic but a living instrument. It had not aged. It had not dated. It had, if anything, acquired a depth that made it more powerful than ever. They tracked her down. The precise mechanics of this, who called whom, how many messages went unanswered before she finally picked up the telephone, have been recounted differently by different sources. What is consistent across all accounts is her reaction: disbelief. Not the performative disbelief of a star pretending to be humble, but the genuine, bewildered incredulity of a person who has been told she is worthless so many times that she can no longer distinguish between flattery and sincerity. "Are you sure you want me?" she asked, or words to that effect. Not somebody better. They were sure. They wanted her voice on a track called "What Have I Done to Deserve This?" A pop song about the confusion of love, built on a pulsing electronic beat and a melody catchier than it had any right to be. They wanted her not as a novelty, not as a nostalgia act, not as a charity case, but as an equal, as the voice the song needed. She said yes. She went into the studio, and what happened next was a miracle, though not the kind involving divine intervention. It was the more mundane, more moving kind, a human being discovering that the thing she thought she had lost still existed. The sessions were not easy. Her perfectionism had not diminished with her confidence. The years of self-doubt had sharpened it to a razor's edge. She recorded multiple takes. She agonized over phrasing. She emerged from the vocal booth after the first attempts and wept. Not from sadness, according to those present, but from the sheer overwhelming strangeness of hearing her own voice do what it had always done after so many years of silence. She had expected it to be gone. It was not gone. It was, against all reason, still there. "What Have I Done to Deserve This?" was released in August 1987. It reached #2 in the United Kingdom, #2 in the United States. It was her first major hit in nearly 2 decades, and it introduced her to an entirely new audience. Teenagers who had never heard of her, 20-somethings who knew her name only as a reference in their parents' record collections. The title deserves attention. What have I done to deserve this? For most of her life, that question had been directed upward, at God, at the universe, at whatever authority was responsible for the fact that she had been born gay in a world that punished it. What have I done to deserve this suffering? But now, suddenly, the same words meant something different. What have I done to deserve this second chance? The question was the same. The answer had changed. There is an irony embedded in the collaboration that neither party acknowledged at the time. Tennant, who would later come out publicly as gay, was in 1987 still guarding his own secret. He and Dusty, two queer artists, one at the beginning of his fame and one at the resurrection of hers, recorded a love song that half the country sang along to without suspecting that either of them understood its themes from personal experience. The truth, once again, smuggled into pop music like contraband in a suitcase. The success of the single led to more. In 1990, the Pet Shop Boys wrote and produced an entire album for her, Reputation. The title was pointed. She was reclaiming the word, taking it back from the tabloids and the industry that had written her off. The album received warm reviews and modest sales, but it put her name back in circulation. It reminded the world that Dusty Springfield was a working artist, not a historical artifact. During this period, a curious detail surfaced, though it had been there all along, waiting to be noticed. Throughout the years of exile and obscurity, she had continued to sing, not on her own records, which had stopped coming, but on other people's. She had worked as a session vocalist, contributing to albums by Elton John, Kiki D, and others. She had done this under a pseudonym, Gladys Thong. Let that name sit for a moment. Gladys Thong. It is so preposterous, so magnificently absurd, that it could only have been invented by a woman with a deep and abiding sense of the ridiculous. The same woman who had thrown custard pies and used goon show voices and been pushed across a stage on roller skates she could not control. Gladys Thong was a joke, but it was also a disguise. One of the finest vocalists of the 20th century was hiding on other people's records under a name that sounded like a burlesque dancer from Blackpool. Why? The practical answer is that she needed the money. The deeper answer is that she could not bear to be Dusty Springfield and also be a backing singer. The legend did not permit it, so she became someone else. Again. Mary, then Dusty, then Gladys. 3 names for a woman who had never worked out which one was real. Tennant, reflecting on the collaboration years later, offered an observation that cuts closer to the truth than most biographical analyses. "We didn't save her," he said. "We just wanted to sing with her. She never asked to be saved." He was right. She had not asked. What she had asked for was simpler and in its way more difficult, to be treated as though she still mattered. The pet shop boys gave her that. They looked at the ruins and saw not a cautionary tale but a cathedral. Damaged, yes. Weathered, certainly, but still standing, still capable of holding something sacred. The comeback was real, but it was not a Hollywood ending. It was a reprieve, not a cure. The drinking was under better control but not vanquished. The anxiety still gnawed. The loneliness, the vast loneliness of a woman who had loved and lost repeatedly, who had no children, no spouse, no family in the conventional sense, remained. She was grateful for the second chance. She was suspicious of it too, the way a person who has been robbed is suspicious of an unlocked door. She was 51 years old. She had survived addiction, violence, poverty, heartbreak, and the particular cruelty of an industry that discards its women with casual efficiency. She had a new album, a new audience, and a voice that, against all probability, still worked. She also had, though she did not yet know it, less than a decade to live. And the final act of her story would be defined not by music or love or scandal, but by the oldest and most democratic of enemies, the body itself, turning against its owner with a thoroughness that no amount of talent or courage could overcome. But that was still in the future. In the early 90s, Dusty Springfield was alive and singing and almost, not quite but almost, willing to believe that the worst was behind her. It was not. The diagnosis came in January 1994. She was in Nashville, Tennessee, recording what would become her final album when the doctors told her she had breast cancer. She was 54 years old. She had spent the last 3 decades abusing her body with alcohol, cocaine, sleeplessness, and the sustained low-grade violence of chronic self-neglect. She had been hospitalized multiple times. She had cut herself. She had starved herself and gorged herself and pickled herself in vodka. And now, as though the body had finally grown tired of being mistreated and decided to mount its own rebellion, the cells in her breast had begun to multiply without permission, without pattern, without mercy. The album was called A Very Fine Love. The songs were gentler than her earlier work, more reflective, more autumnal, as though the voice that sang them understood that this was not the beginning of something but the end. Whether she knew, consciously, that this was her last record is impossible to say. But the voice knew. Voices always know. She did not stop recording. This is the fact that matters most, and it defines the final chapter of her life more precisely than any medical report. The chemotherapy began. The radiation followed. Her hair, what remained of her natural hair after decades of bleaching and wigging, fell out. She wore a wig to the studio. A wig again. In the 60s, the wig had been part of the armor, the construction, the elaborate fiction of Dusty Springfield. Now in the 90s, it served a different purpose. It kept her recognizable. It kept her in the game. It kept her standing at the microphone when her body was begging her to lie down. The routine during the months of treatment was brutal in its simplicity. Morning, hospital. The drip, the chemicals, the nausea that rolled through her in waves, the metallic taste that lodged in her throat and would not leave. Afternoon, rest. Though rest, for a woman whose mind had never learned to be still, was its own form of torture. Evening, studio. She would arrive pale, diminished, wearing the wig and whatever makeup she could manage, and she would sing. Take after take, phrase after phrase. Chasing as she had always chased, a perfection that existed only in her own head and that no recording, however beautiful, could ever quite capture. The voice had changed, not deteriorated, changed. It was closer now, more intimate, as though the distance between the singer and the listener had been reduced to the width of a whispered confidence. The power was still there, but it was held in reserve, deployed sparingly. If the young Dusty had sung as though the world needed to hear her, the older Dusty sang as though she were speaking to one person in a dark room, telling them something important before the candle went out. A Very Fine Love was released in 1995. It sold poorly. The reviews were warm but muted, respectful rather than rapturous, the kind of notices that use words like dignified and mature, which are the critical establishment's way of saying, we admire this, but we are not going to fight for it. The public, once again, was elsewhere. Britpop was raging through the charts. Oasis and Blur were locked in their tabloid war. A woman in her mid-50s singing songs about love and loss could not compete with Liam Gallagher's sneer, and she did not try. The album disappeared. It would be her last. After the chemotherapy, there was a remission. A brief, golden window, one summer, perhaps two, during which the cancer retreated and Dusty allowed herself to believe she might survive. She was cautious with the hope, handling it the way you handle a bird that might bite. But the blood tests were encouraging. The scans were clear. The doctors used words like responding well and cautiously optimistic. And she let those words settle over her like a thin blanket, not warm enough to banish the cold, but better than nothing. Then, in 1996, the cancer returned. It came back without fanfare. A shadow on a scan. A number on a blood test that was slightly too high, then significantly too high, then catastrophically high. The remission was over. The war resumed. But this time, everyone, the doctors, the friends, and eventually Dusty herself, knew which way it would end. The final 3 years were a long, slow contraction. The world grew smaller. London gave way to Henley-on-Thames, a town in Oxfordshire where the river moved with the unhurried patience of water that knows it will reach the sea eventually. She settled there. Settled is perhaps too strong a word. She retreated there, withdrew there, allowed herself to be carried there by the current of diminishing options. The house was modest. There were cats, of course. There were records. There was a telephone that rang less often than it used to. Friends visited, though the circle had narrowed over the decades to a handful of people who had known her long enough to see past the legend to the woman underneath. They found her diminished, but not defeated. Thinner, paler, slower, but still capable of the dry wit and the sudden, startling laughter that had always been her most disarming quality. She made jokes about the wig. She made jokes about the hospital food. She made jokes about dying in the way that people who are actually dying sometimes do, because humor is the last fortification to fall and the one that matters most. She knew by this point that she was not going to recover. The treatments continued, not with the expectation of cure, but with the more modest aim of buying time. Each month was a negotiation with biology, a transaction in which she traded discomfort for days. She accepted the terms. She had no choice. 2 recognitions arrived during this period, both freighted with an irony so heavy it bent the air around them. The first was an OBE, Officer of the Order of the British Empire, awarded in the New Year Honours of 1999. Mary Isabel Catherine Bernadette O'Brien, daughter of Irish immigrants, grandchild of a people who had spent centuries under the heel of the very empire whose honour she was now receiving, was being recognised by the British Crown for her services to music. The irony could not have been lost on her. She had grown up in a household where the memory of Irish subjugation was as present as the wallpaper, where her father's stories about "no Irish" signs had lodged in her consciousness like splinters. And now the empire was pinning a medal on her. She accepted it. What else could she do? She was dying, and the world was finally saying thank you, and it would have taken a harder heart than hers to refuse. The second recognition came from across the Atlantic. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame announced that Dusty Springfield would be inducted in its 1999 ceremony. She learned of the nomination while she was still alive, still conscious, still capable of understanding what it meant. The girl who had recorded herself singing Irving Berlin in a record shop booth at the age of 12. The woman who had been deported from South Africa for the crime of decency. The artist whose masterpiece had reached number 99 on the Billboard chart. The addict who had lived on friends' sofas. The lover who had never been allowed to love openly. This person was being placed alongside Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and Aretha Franklin in the permanent record of popular music. She did not live to attend the ceremony. The gap between her death and her induction was less than a fortnight. Less than a fortnight. The industry that had forgotten her, rediscovered her, exploited her, abandoned her, and finally decided to honor her could not manage to do so while she was still breathing. On the 15th of March, 1999, when her name was read aloud and the audience rose to applaud, the chair that should have held her was empty. The applause filled a room. It could not fill a grave. Was she broken, or was she the only honest person in the room? There is a debate among those who knew her and those who have written about her, a quiet, ongoing argument about the fundamental nature of Dusty Springfield that is worth pausing over here because it speaks to something larger than one woman's biography. The biographer Karen Bartlett described Dusty as essentially split, 2 personalities inhabiting one body. The frightened, self-loathing Mary O'Brien and the magnificent, defiant Dusty Springfield. 2 women, 1 life. It is a compelling framework, dramatic, symmetrical, easy to grasp. It has the satisfying shape of a story, but not everyone agrees. Simon Bell, a session singer who worked with her in her later years, offered a different view. There weren't 2 people, he said. There was one very tired person. One very tired person. The words are plain, almost flat. They lack the drama of the 2 personalities theory, but they may be closer to the truth. because the idea of a split implies that the fracture was internal, that something in her nature caused her to break in two, and that framing, however unintentionally, places the blame on her. She was broken. She was divided. She was ill. But what if the fracture was not internal? What if it was imposed? What if the world, the church that called her love a sin, the industry that required her to be heterosexual, the era that offered no language for what she was, the fame that demanded a mask and punished her for wearing it? What if the world broke her and she spent her life trying to hold the pieces together? Not two people, but one person under impossible pressure. One very tired person doing her best. The question has no definitive answer. The power of her story lies partly in its ambiguity, in the fact that after 6 decades and a shelf of biographies and 1,000 hours of recorded music, we still do not entirely know who she was. She made sure of that. The mask was too good. The performance was too convincing. She hid herself so thoroughly that even she, in the end, could not find the way back. The 2nd of March, 1999, a Tuesday, Henley-on-Thames, Oxfordshire. The weather, as it tends to be in early March in southern England, was grey. Not dramatically grey, not the Gothic grey of a Victorian novel, but the ordinary, damp, unremarkable grey of a country that has made peace with its climate and expects nothing better. The river moved slowly past the bottom of the town. The trees were bare. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke and the faintest trace of something green. Spring, approaching but not yet arrived. In a house near the river, Dusty Springfield died. She was 59 years old. Her 60th birthday was 6 weeks away. She did not die on stage. She did not die in the blaze of flashbulbs or in the arms of a lover or with a final, defiant song on her lips. She died in a small house, in a small town, in the grey English light of a Tuesday in March. There were no cameras. There were no crowds. There was, one imagines, the sound of the river and the rustle of cats moving through the house, and the particular silence that descends when a person who has filled rooms with her voice finally stops making any sound at all. Mary O'Brien died as Mary O'Brien, not as Dusty Springfield, pop icon, but as the woman she had been before the beehive and the coal and the fame. The armor had been removed piece by piece by the illness. The wig was gone. The makeup was gone. The voice, that dark, cracked, impossible instrument that had made millions of strangers feel understood, was silent. What remained was the person underneath, the girl from West Hampstead, the tomboy, the frightened child who had sung Irving Berlin into a recording booth and heard, in her own voice, something that both thrilled and terrified her. She had left instructions about what should happen afterwards. Her body was to be cremated. Her ashes were to be divided. Half would be scattered at Henley-on-Thames, in the town where she had spent her final years. The other half would be taken to Ireland, to the coast, to the edge of the Atlantic, to the land her parents had come from and that she herself had never lived in but had carried inside her like a song she knew by heart but had never performed. Even in death, she could not be in one place. The ashes were split, just as she had been split between England and Ireland, between Mary and Dusty, between the person she was and the person the world required her to be. 2 countries, 2 names, 2 handfuls of dust scattered on 2 different winds. It was the final act of a life defined by division, and it was, in its quiet way, the most eloquent statement she ever made. The obituaries were generous, as obituaries tend to be. The Guardian noted the custard pies. The Times noted the voice. The music press noted the influence. Everyone agreed that she had been great, that she had been undervalued, that she had suffered more than she should have. Everyone was kind. Everyone was too late. In the days that followed, flowers appeared outside the house in Henley. Cards, letters, handwritten notes from people she had never met, people whose lives had been changed by a voice on a record, a song heard late at night, a melody that had accompanied a first kiss or a last goodbye. They did not know about Norma or Tedder or the saucepan or the cats or the convent school or the Evening Standard interview. They knew the voice, and the voice, it turned out, was enough. On the 15th of March, less than a fortnight after her death, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame held its annual induction ceremony. Dusty Springfield's name was called. A tribute was paid. The audience, musicians, executives, journalists, fans, stood and applauded. The sound filled the auditorium, bounced off the walls, rose towards the ceiling. Somewhere in Henley-on-Thames, or on the coast of Ireland, or in the space between the two, the ashes that had been Dusty Springfield did not hear it. But the music she had left behind, on vinyl, on tape, on compact disc, in the memory of everyone who had ever stood still while "You Don't Have to Say You Love Me" played, that music heard it. That music would always hear it. She was gone, but the voice was not finished yet. It had one more act to play, one more audience to find, one more generation to reach. And it would find them in the most unexpected place imaginable. A darkened cinema, a Quentin Tarantino film, and the opening bars of a song the world had ignored when it was new and could no longer ignore now. And when, decades later, Nelson Mandela walked free and the apartheid state crumbled, nobody telephoned Dusty Springfield to say thank you. Nobody needed to. The act had not been performed for gratitude. It had been performed because a girl who grew up hearing her father's stories about no Irish signs could not bring herself to look at a segregated audience and pretend it was normal. There is a quieter legacy too, one that has nothing to do with charts or awards or films. The legacy of a woman who spent her life trying to reconcile two names, two countries, two versions of herself. Mary and Dusty, England and Ireland, the Catholic girl who loved women and the glittering pop star who could never quite say so out loud. She solved the problem the only way she could, by dividing her ashes between the Thames and the Irish coast. Even in death, she refused to be contained in a single place. Tom Springfield, her brother, the man who had given her a surname and a start, survived her by 15 years. He died in 2014 at the age of 79 in relative obscurity. The songwriter who had pennied Georgie Girl and launched his sister's career spent his final decades out of the public eye. They had remained in contact, though the relationship, complicated by old rivalries and the particular guilt of a sibling who had watched his sister's destruction from a distance, never fully healed. He was not at her bedside when she died. That absence speaks to the one wound neither of them ever managed to close, the distance between the brother who built the stage and the sister who set it on fire. Norma Tenga, the woman who had perhaps loved her most truthfully, outlived her by 2 decades, dying in December 2019 without ever having told her story to the press. Faye Harris disappeared from public record entirely, her years with Dusty surviving only in the biographies that mention her name in passing. Tedder Bracci, the woman with the saucepan, faded into the same obscurity from which she had briefly, violently emerged. The lovers vanished. The music stayed. Who was she then? Was she the frightened Mary who washed her hands until they bled and hid behind goon show voices? Was she the defiant Dusty who faced down apartheid police and pet shop boys producers with equal terror and equal grace? Was she Gladys Thong, hiding on other people's records, too proud to use her real name and too broke to refuse the work? Was she the woman who collected 12 stray cats because she could not collect 12 reasons to stay alive? Simon Bell gave the simplest answer. There weren't two people. There was one very tired person. Perhaps that is the only answer that matters. One person, one voice, one life spent trying to hold together a self that the world kept pulling apart. She never found peace, not the lasting kind, not the kind that settles into your bones and stays. She found moments. The 4 years with Norma, the 3 nights at Drury Lane, the afternoon in the studio when she heard her voice on a pet shop boy's track and wept because it still worked. Moments. Bright, fleeting, insufficient. But moments were all she ever got, and she held onto each one with the desperate grip of a woman who knew that the darkness between them was where she actually lived. The Catholic Church, the institution that had shaped her guilt and her longing in equal measure, never changed its position on homosexuality during her lifetime. She died, as she had lived, in a state of unresolved tension with the faith she had been born into. Whether she prayed at the end, whether she made peace with a God who had been presented to her as both loving Father and merciless Judge, is not recorded. That silence, too, is part of the story. Some doors stay closed. But here is the thing about Dusty Springfield, the thing that all the biographies circle around without quite landing on, the thing that makes her story not just sad but magnificent. She kept going. Through the drinking, the drugs, the self-harm, the poverty, the violence, the cancer, the loneliness, the shame, the Catholic guilt, the closet, the comebacks, the collapses, through all of it, she kept going. Not because she was brave, though she was. Not because she was strong, though she was that too. But because the voice demanded it. The voice would not let her stop. It was the one part of her that never broke, never faltered, never lost faith in its own existence. Everything else could be destroyed. The voice endured, and it endures still. In a small house by the river in Henley-on-Thames, the needle drops one last time. The room is empty now. The cats are gone. The records are stacked neatly on their shelves, spines facing outward, alphabetized with the care of a woman who could not control her life but could control her record collection. The river moves outside the window, slow and grey and patient. It has been moving since before she was born. It will be moving long after everyone who remembers her is gone. The music begins, not loudly, not dramatically. Just the soft crackle of vinyl, the gentle hiss of the groove, and then that voice, dark, warm, cracked in exactly the right places, singing the opening bars of "You don't have to say you love me." She does not have to say anything. The voice says it all. It says, "I was here, I loved, I was afraid, I sang anyway." And somewhere in the space between the two countries she could never quite choose between, in the gap between the two names she could never quite reconcile, the woman who was once Mary Isabel Catherine Bernadette O'Brien and later became Dusty Springfield is finally still. Her hands are no longer shaking. She is standing in an airport in Johannesburg. It is December 1964. The sun is hammering down. 2 policemen are walking her across the tarmac. Her passport is gone. Her tour is cancelled. Her career, though she does not know it yet, will survive this. Her heart, though she does not know this either, will not survive what comes after. But right now, in this moment, she is 25 years old, and she has just done the bravest thing she will ever do. And somewhere inside the armor of lacquer and coal, behind the mask she built to hide the girl she was ashamed to be, Mary O'Brien is smiling. She is smiling because she knows, for the first and perhaps the only time in her life, that she has done the right thing, not the safe thing, not the smart thing, not the thing that the industry or the church or the world required of her. The right thing. The aircraft door opens. She climbs the steps. She does not look back. 59 years later, the song is still playing. The needle is still turning. And as long as anyone, anywhere, in any room, in any city, in any country where the river meets the sea, drops a record onto a turntable and lets that voice fill the silence, she is still here. Not as a legend, not as a cautionary tale, not as a saint or a sinner or a symbol of anything larger than herself, but simply as the sound that once made a frightened girl in West Hampstead believe she might one day be brave enough to be herself. The record plays on. The voice remains. And that, in the end, is the only ending she ever needed.